These were pulled from your garage. Tell me why your prints are all over them. Look at the photo. That's you, isn't it? Yeah.
A suicide was reported. The scene appeared so perfect that no one questioned it, and the husband remained unusually calm until the small details started to not match, and investigators gradually realized something here wasn't just wrong, it had been arranged far too carefully. In May 2018, in the city of Westfield, a midday 911 call reporting a suicide inside a private home marked the beginning of a case that initially seemed straightforward, as the husband, Brian Fanian, quickly provided a clear explanation of what had happened, and based on the initial context, there appeared to be no signs of a crime. However, shortly after authorities arrived at the scene, certain details began to make them pause and take a closer look, and those early doubts prevented the case from being quickly closed as expected, instead gradually opening up a more complex line of investigation, where the original story began to be questioned. The victim was identified as Amy Fanian, 51 years old, a woman deeply devoted to her family and her faith, who had spent most of her life caring for her husband and children and maintaining a stable home throughout more than 3 decades of marriage. She was not the type of person who stood out in a crowd, but she was someone everyone who met her remembered for her gentleness, patience, and the way she always put others before herself. Friends described Amy as principled, someone who believed in the value of family and found meaning in simple things such as raising her children, participating in community activities, and maintaining her spiritual life through religious faith. In the eyes of many, she was the model of a traditional wife and mother, unassuming yet resilient, quiet yet deeply influential to those around her. Her marriage of over 30 years gave the impression of a strong, stable relationship with few visible disruptions, and although not perfect, it was still seen as a family that had endured many stages of life together. For that reason, from an outside perspective, there were no clear signs that Amy was facing a serious personal crisis, nor any indication that she was in a state that could lead to an extreme decision, which made her death all the more difficult to understand, as it occurred in a context where everything appeared to be proceeding normally, even peacefully. The victim's husband, Brian Fanian, was a detective with the Westfield Police Department, a man who had worked in the field for many years and was considered an experienced officer who understood how an investigation operates, from the crime scene to the interrogation room. In the eyes of the community, he was calm, disciplined, and lived a life closely tied to his family as well as religious activities, an image that conveyed trustworthiness and stability, especially in a small town where personal reputation carries great weight. However, it was precisely this background that made his role in the case more complex. On May 8, 2018, around midday, Brian left the police station during his break and returned home, where Amy Fanian was preparing lunch, and according to his account, their conversation quickly turned into an argument, continuing the tension that had existed since the previous evening, revolving around familiar issues such as retirement plans, personal intentions, and family activities. Things that seemed small but reflected increasingly clear differences between the two, and as emotions escalated, Brian stated that he placed his firearm down in a spot in the room and stepped away to take a shower, but when he returned, he said he saw Amy holding the gun, and from that moment on, according to him, everything happened quickly beyond his control. The 911 call was made shortly afterward by Brian Fanian, his voice reflecting panic as he reported that his wife, Amy Fanian, had just caused a serious incident inside their home, and only minutes later, police officers and medical personnel arrived at the residence in Westfield, where they encountered a scene that initially appeared consistent with his account, with Amy found in the dining area. No clear signs of forced entry from outside, and the husband present, cooperative, and ready to recount what he said had happened. However, as investigators began to look more closely rather than just at the overall picture, they gradually noticed small but significant details. The arrangement of objects in the room did not fully reflect a sudden, impulsive situation. The trajectory of the bullet did not easily align with the described scenario, and the overall scene gave the impression of slight staging, rather than a sequence of events unfolding naturally within seconds. These factors were not enough to draw an immediate conclusion, but for those experienced at the scene, they were signs that could not be ignored. And in that moment, the case began to shift from something that seemed clear to a question without an answer, as the sense that something was not right became increasingly apparent. The scene was processed more thoroughly, and the entire area was secured according to standard forensic procedures, and the case quickly moved beyond the initial verification stage into a full investigation, with investigators working layer by layer, from documenting the precise positions of objects and traces in the space to reconstructing what may have happened based on physical logic. While forensic experts analyzed the bullet's trajectory, estimated the distance, and evaluated related factors to determine whether the evidence at the scene matched the initial explanation. At the same time, Brian Fanian's statement was carefully compared against each new finding, and it was in this process that inconsistencies began to appear, not obvious contradictions at first, but subtle discrepancies in sequence, positioning, and the way events were described, which, for experienced investigators, are often indicators that a story requires deeper examination. Meanwhile, the scope of the investigation expanded beyond the physical scene as electronic devices, communication data, and personal activity were collected for analysis, allowing investigators to build a more complete picture of what had occurred beforehand. And as more data was cross-checked, the case increasingly appeared not as a single event that could be simply explained, but as a chain of interconnected factors that needed to be verified piece by piece before any conclusion could be reached. As the initial evidence began to be cross-checked and more unclear points continued to emerge, investigators realized they needed more than just a statement taken at the scene, and that was when Brian Fanian was invited to the station to be interviewed in a controlled environment, where every detail could be carefully examined and each response could be analyzed over time. During the formal interviews, Brian remained calm, cooperative, and willing to provide a full account of the events. During his interviews with investigators, Brian Fanian stated that around 11:45 a.m. on May 8th, he left the police station and returned home to have lunch with Amy Fanian, and as soon as they met, the two continued an argument that had carried over from the previous evening, revolving around issues that seemed familiar but reflected deeper differences in their lives, including retirement plans, lifestyle changes, whether or not to buy a second home, and Amy's desire to get another dog while Brian disagreed. And what frustrated him most was that Amy had signed them up for a family play on the same day he had planned to attend a tournament he had already scheduled in advance. According to Brian, the argument escalated to the point that he decided to step away from the situation, removing his firearm and placing it somewhere in the room before going into the bathroom. But when he returned, he said he saw Amy holding the gun in an emotional state, and from that moment on, according to him, everything happened very quickly and beyond his control, after which he called 911 for help. Initially, the case was approached as a self-caused incident leading to death, but as investigators analyzed the scene more carefully, they began to notice several details that did not fully align with that scenario. A plate of food remained unfinished on the dining table, papers and objects appeared disturbed, the position of the firearm did not completely match the description given, and the bullet's trajectory suggested a more complex sequence of events. When asked about Amy's mental state, Brian said that she had previously gone through a period of needing psychological medication but had recently been stable, while also emphasizing that she could become very angry in private situations, although this side of her was rarely seen by others. When investigators questioned him about the possibility of an extramarital relationship, Brian admitted that he knew a woman named Corey, whom he met during a religious trip to Mexico, and that they had kept in touch and grown closer over time. And although he insisted the relationship had not crossed boundaries, he acknowledged there was emotional closeness and a degree of flirtation in their communication. Notably, when asked to hand over his phone for examination, he hesitated and warned that there might be content that could be misinterpreted, which immediately drew investigators' attention, and once the data was recovered, they found hundreds of deleted messages, many of them containing affectionate exchanges between Brian and Corey, particularly the day before Amy died, when the two had exchanged a large number of messages expressing attachment and expectations for the future, and in addition, analysis of Brian's electronic devices revealed search histories related to sensitive topics such as methods of causing death and forensic elements. which significantly shifted the direction of the investigation and reinforced the hypothesis that the case might not be as simple as initially described. Meanwhile, Corey later admitted that her relationship with Brian had gone beyond friendship, that they had engaged in intimate interactions and met frequently, and that Brian had expressed difficulty ending his marriage due to concerns about financial consequences and personal image. Another notable detail was that after Amy's death, her family, including her parents and siblings, initially believed it was a spontaneous act and even expressed support for Brian, which made the case more complex. Both in terms of investigation and public perception, and during this period, despite growing suspicions, Brian was still allowed to leave after the first interview because investigators did not yet have sufficient legal grounds to detain him, effectively shifting his position from a cooperative husband in the eyes of others to someone the authorities needed to monitor carefully in the following stages. However, among them, only one person spoke in the opposite direction: Anna, Amy Fanion's younger sister, who agreed to testify and provided a crucial detail, stating that Brian had once told her he had searched for information on how to stage a murder to look like a suicide. And although Brian explained that he did so at Amy's request after watching a television program, Anna insisted that her sister had no habit of watching such content, making that explanation difficult to accept. By May 17, 2018, Brian was summoned again to clarify inconsistencies in his statements, and when confronted with messages showing an emotional relationship with another woman, he admitted that his behavior was wrong and shameful, but attempted to separate it from the incident. While investigators continued to focus on the most critical aspect, the sequence of events on the day it occurred, asking Brian to describe each step in detail, from how he placed the firearm, how he left the room, to the moment he returned. And it was at this point that inconsistencies became more apparent, as Brian could not clearly recall basic details such as Amy's position or posture at that time, something that, for a recent event, would normally be remembered more precisely. At the same time, forensic analysis results indicated that the characteristics of the injury and related factors did not align with a self-inflicted scenario at close range. And when investigators compared these findings with Brian's account, they began to consider a new hypothesis: whether the incident had been staged to appear as a suicide. Meanwhile, shortly after the event, Brian's relationship with the other woman continued to develop, with the two maintaining close contact and expressing plans for the future, further highlighting the possibility of a personal motive. And alongside all of this, the investigative team continued working quietly behind the scenes, collaborating with experts to reconstruct the scene through modeling and spatial analysis. And when all the data was placed together, it gradually pointed in the same direction that what had happened did not fit the original narrative, and the story was beginning to be viewed in a completely different light. Forensic and firearms experts analyzing the case pointed out a critical detail related to the characteristics of the wound, noting that in cases where an incident is self-inflicted at close range, there are typically traces of gunshot residue on the surrounding skin, a phenomenon known as stippling. However, in the case of Amy Fanion, these signs were completely absent, raising serious questions about the distance and conditions of the shot. In addition, experts also examined the position of the firearm after the incident, based on the general assumption that if a right-handed person uses a gun on the right side of the head, the weapon would likely fall near that area, or at least not far from it. Yet at the scene, the firearm was found on the opposite side and at a considerable distance from Amy's position, a detail difficult to reconcile with the initial scenario. Beyond the physical evidence, digital data also played a significant role, as analysis revealed that Brian Fanion had taken actions related to deleting data from his personal devices, including messages and communication records, further increasing suspicion. At the same time, throughout the investigation, there were no signs that Amy had left any final message or shown indications of preparing for an extreme decision, and those close to her, from family to friends, consistently described her as positive, full of life, devoted to her family, and fond of caring for pets, which stood in stark contrast to the initial hypothesis. When all these elements, forensics, scene positioning, digital evidence, and personal background, were considered together, investigators began to form a new hypothesis: that what had occurred was not a spontaneous act, but the result of a sequence of events tied to personal conflict and underlying motives, thereby redirecting the entire investigation toward a criminal path. And after more than a year of evidence gathering, in November 2019, a grand jury in Massachusetts formally indicted Brian Fanian on a charge of first-degree murder, marking a critical turning point that moved the case into the trial phase. After a prolonged period of gathering and consolidating evidence, Brian Fanian was arrested just a few months after officially retiring from the police force, marking a turning point that showed the case had fully shifted into a serious criminal investigation. At the initial hearing, Brian maintained his innocence, and the defense quickly constructed an argument framing the incident as a family tragedy, suggesting that Amy Fanian may have been under psychological pressure leading to an impulsive act, while emphasizing Brian's personal background as a longtime officer with no criminal record and a respected position in the community as evidence that he had no inclination to commit a crime. And based on that, they filed for bail, arguing that he posed no danger to society and would cooperate with the legal process. In addition, the defense team presented alternative explanations for the unfavorable evidence, including bringing in experts to demonstrate that certain forensic indicators could be influenced by physical factors such as environment or personal characteristics, and calling close acquaintances as witnesses to support the possibility that the incident resulted from an emotional reaction during a moment of tension. However, the prosecution strongly countered these claims, emphasizing that professional experience and social image do not eliminate the possibility of committing a crime, and in this case, the evidence pointed not only to a clear motive but also to signs of information concealment and attempts to shape the direction of the investigation. After reviewing arguments from both sides, the court denied the bail request and ordered Brian to be held in custody pending trial, and during this time, the case continued to draw attention as new details gradually emerged, and by 2023, after multiple delays due to external factors, the trial officially began at the Hampton County Court, where prosecution and defense entered a direct confrontation, with the prosecution presenting a tightly connected chain of evidence to demonstrate that what occurred was not a random event, while the defense continued to propose alternative possibilities to create reasonable doubt for the jury. However, after the trial and deliberation process, the jury reached its final verdict, finding Brian Fanian guilty of first-degree murder, resulting in a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. On a seemingly ordinary afternoon, Amy Fanian became the victim of a tragedy in which the person behind it was the very one she had trusted for more than 3 decades. Her death not only left an irreplaceable void in her family, but also exposed a chilling truth. Sometimes, the greatest dangers do not come from the outside, but exist within the closest relationships. This is not just a story about a case, but a story about a man who once understood the law, understood how investigations work, and believed he could control everything, until the truth gradually emerged in a way no one could change. The case you have just followed was adapted by the channel's team based on a real event that took place in 2018 in Westfield, where behind a seemingly quiet life lay long-standing hidden conflicts that ultimately led to an irreversible outcome. What makes this case thought-provoking is not only the act itself, but how it was concealed, how a story can be constructed convincingly enough to mislead others, yet still fail to withstand the scrutiny of science and time. The lesson here is not about fear, but about awareness. Not everything is as it appears, and sometimes, the truth only reveals itself when every small detail is placed back in its proper position. If you want to continue exploring cases where the truth is uncovered layer by layer beneath carefully crafted disguises, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss upcoming content, because behind every story, there is always another truth waiting to be seen.